I am not, however, here to introduce her. I will leave that to our moderator. That is our format. Our moderator, Christine Hemmerrex, is herself a highly praised Flemish novelist, essayist, and short story writer. She has also written screenplays, and she has adapted Anna Karenina to the stage. Stylistically, she's known for leaving things out, leaving it to the reader to fill them in, something which could also be said for Amy Bloom. Christine Hemmerrex has won several literary prizes. She teaches English at the Catholic University in Brussels and creative writing at the Herman Tierlink Institute in Antwerp. I will now give it to Christine Hemmerrex.
Good evening and welcome everybody. It's always a pleasure being here in this wonderful venue and finding that there are still people interested in reading and literature. I realize this could be a very brief evening since both Amy Bloom and myself are reputed for leaving things out, so we could leave the whole evening out and leave it to you to fill the bits in. But we won't do that, will we, Amy? Anyway, some people are blessed in life, or let me put it differently, some people are blessed in their careers. The author Amy Bloom is certainly one of them. She's been nominated for various awards, such as the National Book Award. She's written articles for prestigious periodicals, such as The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Vogue, and Salon.com. Her short fiction has appeared in the Best American Short Stories and has won her a National Magazine Award. She writes fiction, non-fiction, screenplays, teleplays, and television shows. In short, hers is an enviably rich and successful career. In an interview, Amy Bloom declared, "I think my sister and I both grew up thinking that we would do what we wanted for work, that we would, of course, support our own households, and that we were apparently genetically incapable of working for others." With that set of mind, there is apparently but one career move: you become a writer. But Amy Bloom has not always been a writer. According to information I found on the internet, which of course may not be reliable, the internet is notoriously inaccurate. But anyway, according to the internet, Amy Bloom has explored so many different professional avenues that it leaves me wondering how she's managed to pack it all in one life. A life that obviously isn't over yet. She began her career with an undergraduate degree in theater and political science and went on to work as an actor. But soon she decided it was not the right career for her. She got married, had 3 children, and trained to be a psychotherapist because, she says, and I quote, "I am endlessly curious and a voyeur. I like listening to people, and I'm not easily bored or annoyed by people's stories." For some 10 years, she had a private practice, but then she took up writing. It is tempting to say that after having listened to other people's stories, she felt it was time to make up her own. Or maybe the human heart had yielded all its secrets to her, and it was time to share what she had learned. If anybody asked me to define the quintessential characteristic of Bloom's work, I would say the absence of anger. I would say the utter tolerance for all kinds of human behavior. I would say an understanding of what it means to be a human being. I would say wisdom. Some of her characters behave appallingly, and yet they are not condemned by their author nor by the heroine, who is at the receiving end of their bad behavior. A Dutch therapist, who herself later became a successful poet and novelist, so guess who I am talking about, once told me that in her therapeutic work, she basically offered her patients forgiveness. We all harbor secrets, she said. We all have inner darkness of which we feel ashamed and for which we crave forgiveness. While reading Amy Bloom, it occurred to me that she too offers her readers forgiveness. And she reminds us of the fact that we all have in common our humanity, our common humanity. It may be exactly that quality which accounts for her success. Amy Bloom is over on a visit to launch the Dutch translation of her most recent novel, Away, which has been translated as Op zoek, which seems to mean exactly the opposite, but anyway. In a moment, she'll treat us to a reading from that novel, and after she and I will have a conversation about her work, you will be invited to join in, so you're warned. But let me first reveal to you the closing sentence of one of her stories with a wonderful title, Love Invents Us. It is also the title of a collection of stories. The main character of the story is loved most inappropriately by a Mr. Klein, who runs a fur store, and next by Mr. Canetti, who teaches her to play the piano. Far from inflicting trauma on the young and inexperienced Lisbeth, these men's attentions give her confidence and a sense of her own beauty. Love is something to be celebrated and welcomed, not to be frowned upon. Love turns the ugly duckling into a dazzling swan. Love invents us, indeed. Let me add at once that the lovers do not touch Lisbeth, or only a little, at least in that story. They transgress, and they don't transgress. And now for the closing sentence or sentences, I quote. One day he bent forward to push my sleeves back over my aching wrists, and I saw my beautiful self take shape in his eyes. I loved him, too. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you Amy Bloom.
The first chapter in the novel is, like most of the chapter titles in the first half of the book, from a Russian or Yiddish lullaby. This one is called "And Lost There a Golden Feather in a Foreign, Foreign Land." I have to say that all of the Yiddish lullabies have titles and stanzas like this. They are mostly things like, "If I had chains, I would pull you to me," or "I have lost my youth like a gambler with bad cards," which is not what I would sing to a small child in a crib. Nevertheless, everybody gets out of the crib and makes their way, some of them to America. It is always like this. The best parties are made by people in trouble. There are 150 girls lining the sidewalk outside the Goldfaden Theater. They spill into the street and down to the corners, and Lillian Labe, who has spent her first 35 days in this country ripping stitches out of navy silk flowers until her hands were dyed blue, thinks that it's like an all-girl Ellis Island. American-looking girls chewing gum, kicking their high heels against the broken pavement, and girls so green they're still wearing fringed brown shawls over their braided hair. The street is like her village on market day, times a million. A boy playing a harp, a man with an accordion, and a terrible, patchy little animal. A woman selling straw brooms from a basket strapped to her back, making a giant fan behind her head. A colored man singing in a pink suit and black shoes with pink spats, and tired women who look like women Lillian would have known at home in Turov, smiling at the song or the singer. Some of the girls hold red sparklers in their hands and swing one another around the waist. And two older women, pale and dark-eyed, are pulling along their pale, dark-eyed children. That's a mistake, Lillian thinks. They should ask a neighbor to watch the children, or they should just leave their children in Gallagher's Bar and Grill at this point and hope for the best, but that's the kind of thing you say when you have no children. Lillian makes herself smile at the children as she walks past their mothers. They reek of bad luck. Lillian is lucky. Her father had told her so. He told everyone after she fell in the river twice and didn't drown and didn't die of pneumonia. He said that smart was good, and Lillian was smart, he said, and pretty was useful, and Lillian was pretty enough. But lucky was better than both of them put together, and he had hoped she'd be lucky her whole life, he said, and she had been at the time. He also said, you make your own luck, And Lillian takes Judith, the only girl she knows, by the hand, and they push their way through the middle of the crowd and then to the front. And they are pushed themselves into the place they want to be, which is the sewing room of the Goldfaden Theater. And suddenly, there are two men right in front of them, who even the greenest girls can see are stars in the firmament of life, visitors from a brighter and more beautiful planet. Mr. Reuben Burstein, owner of the Goldfaden and the Bartlestone Theaters, the impresario of Second Avenue with his barrel chest and black silk vest and gray hair brushed back like Beethoven's. And his son, Mr. Meyer Burstein, the matinee idol, the man whose performance of Yankel in The Child of Nature was so tragically handsome and so forceful a dancer and so sweet a tenor that when he romanced the Gentile Russian girl Natasha, women in the audience wept as if their own husbands had abandoned them. And when Yankel killed himself on stage, unwilling to marry poor pregnant Natasha and live as a Christian, everyone wept, not unhappily, at his beautiful, tortured death. And Meyer Burstein is taller than his father, with a smart black fedora, a cigarette, and no vest over his silk shirt. The two men move through the crowd like gardeners inspecting the flower beds of English estates, like plantation owners on market day. Whatever it is like, Lillian doesn't care. She will be the flower, the slave, the pretty thing, or the despised and necessary thing, as long as she is the thing chosen from among the other things. And Mr. Burstein the elder stands close to Lillian and makes an announcement, and his voice is such a pleasure to listen to that the girls stand there like fools, some of them with tears in their eyes at its gathering thunderous quality, even as he is merely telling them that Miss Morris will pass around a clipboard and they should write down their names and their skills or have someone write it down for them, and she will interview them all and indicate who should return tomorrow evening for more interviewing. There's a murmur at this. It was not so easy to get away for even one night, and Lillian thinks that the bad luck mothers and the women who look as if they've walked all the way from Brooklyn will not be back. Miss Morris approaches Lillian, and Judith and Lillian have been rehearsing for this moment. Very well, thank you, if the question seems to be about her health. I am a seamstress. My father was a tailor, if the question contains the words sew or costume or work. I attend night classes, said with a dazzling smile in response to any question she doesn't understand. But Judith will get the job. Things being what they are, Lillian knows that a girl who can sew and speak English is a better choice than a girl who just got here and can barely do either. And Lillian studies the profile of Reuben Burstein. He looks like a man from home. She heard that big burnished voice, and then like a small mark on a cheek, like a tilt in the little finger of a hand injured a long time ago, the tilt and the injury both forgotten. Underneath, she heard Yiddish, and Lillian moves. She presses close to him and says, "My name is Lillian Leib. I speak Yiddish very well, as you can hear, and I also speak Russian very well." And she digs her nails into her palms and switches into Russian, if you prefer it. And my English is coming along. And she adds in Yiddish, "Es memuz ken men," which is when one must, one can. And when Reuben Burstein does smile, she says, "And I am fluent in sewing of every kind." And the Bursteins look at her, and Miss Morris, who was born right here on the Lower East Side and graduated from the 8th grade and speaks standard Brooklyn English, also looks at Lillian without enthusiasm. And the crowd of women look at her as if she has just hoisted up her skirt to her waist and shown her bare bottom to the world. It is just that vulgar, just that embarrassing, just that effective. And the elder Mr. Burstein moves closer to Lillian. "Bold," he says, and he holds her chin in his hand like he will kiss her on the mouth. "Bold? Bold is good." And he waves his other hand and tells the women to form groups of 4, and there are immediately 15 groups of 4, and Lillian loses sight of Judith. She feels like a dog leaping over the garden wall. She smiles up at Reuben Burstein, she smiles at Meyer Burstein, she smiles for good measure at Miss Morris. Lillian has endured the murder of her family and the loss of her daughter Sophie, an ocean crossing like a death march, intimate life with strangers in her cousin Frida's 2 rooms, smelling of men and urine and fried food and uncertainty and need. Just so, she thinks, and she smiles up at these 3 people, the new king and queen and prince of her life, as if she has just risen from a soft, high feather bed and is enjoying an especially pretty morning. And Reuben Burstein says in Yiddish, "We'll come back tomorrow morning, clever pussycat." And Meyer Burstein says, "Really, miss, how is your English?" And Lillian says very carefully, "I attend night classes." And she adds, "And they go very well, thank you." It had taken 8 hours for Lillian to get from Ellis Island to the Battery Park of Manhattan, and another 4 to find Cousin Frida's apartment building. She had read Cousin Frida's letter and the directions to Great Jones Street while she stood on 3 different lines in the registry room while the doctor watched them all climb the stairs looking for signs of lameness or bad hearts or feeble-mindedness. "You step lively," a man said to her on the crossing. "They don't want no idiots in America." Also, and he showed Lillian a card with writing on it, "You see something that looks like this, you scratch your right ear." And Lillian tried to memorize the shape of the letters. "What does it say?" she said. "What do you think? It says, scratch your right ear. You do that, they think you can read English." "My brother sent me this," the man said, and he put the card back in his pocket like a man with money. Lillian walked through the last door marked "Push to New York" and showed her letter to a man moving luggage onto the ferry, and he smiled and shrugged, and she held up the letter and the block printed address a dozen times to faces that were blank or worse than blank, knowing and dubious. She hadn't imagined that in front of her new home in her new country after the trolley cars and the men with signs on their fronts and backs, and the women in short skirts, and the colored boys with chairs on their backs and pictures of shiny shoes around their necks, that the first thing she would see when she finally got to Great Jones Street was a woman in her nightgown and a man's overcoat, weeping. Lillian watched the woman open a folding chair and take a china plate from her pocket and hold it on her lap, and people passed by and put a few coins in the plate. Cousin Frida had run down the stairs and hugged Lillian. "Dear little Lillian," she said, "my home is your home." And Lillian watched the woman across the street sitting stock still in the chair, tears flowing down her face onto her large loose breast, dripping onto the plate with the coins. "Eviction," Frida said. "You can't pay, you can't stay." She said in Yiddish, "Es ist schwer zu machen ein Leben." It's hard to make a living. She wanted to make sure Lillian understood. She didn't want Lillian to be frightened. She said everything would work out fine between them, but Lillian should see right away how it's nothing to go from having a home, which Lillian does now with her cousin Frida, to having no home at all, like the woman over there who was just thrown out this morning, and Lillian does see. And Frida took Lillian by the hand and crossed the street. She put a penny in the plate and said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Lipkin," and taking Lillian up the stairs to her apartment, Frida said to Lillian, "Poor thing," and she gestured over her shoulder to a small room filled with a bed and 2 wooden crates. "You can share this with Judith." And the lesson of Mrs. Lipkin was not lost on Lillian, who was still holding everything she had in the world in Yitzhak Nierenberg's leather satchel. It's always the same dream. She's dead. She's blind too. All she can see is a bursting red inside her eyelids, as if she's on her back in Turo's farthest field on the brightest day in June, closing her eyes to the midday sun. The entire world, the trees, the birds, the chimneys, has disappeared. There's nothing but a gently falling white sky, which becomes her bed sheet. She sees everything now in the dream, in all directions. The red floor, her husband lying in the doorway, covered in blood so thick his nightshirt is black and stiff with it, and there are things on the floor between them. Her grandmother's teapot in 4 pieces, the bucket standing on its mouth, the cloth they hung for privacy, a hand. Her mother is lying on the floor too, gutted like a chicken through her apron, which falls like a rough curtain on either side of her, and Lillian sees herself standing naked in the red room, and the color recedes like the tide. Her father lies at the front door, face down, still holding his cleaver against the intruders, and her daughter's little bed is empty, and another hand is on the floor beside it, and she can see the thin gold line of her husband's wedding band, and Lillian screams herself awake. Judith is next to her and says, "Bad dreams." Lillian nods her head, and Judith says sensibly and not unkindly, "You don't have to tell me." And Lillian doesn't tell her that she had heard the men whisper beneath their bedroom window that the walls of the house had been so thin in places she heard a man cough on the other side of the wall and another man sigh, and it seems to Lillian that she had stopped breathing. Little Sophie lay on her stomach, dreaming, sucking the corner of her quilt, and the men put their shoulders to the door, hard, and Lillian reached for Sophie. And the walls rocked violently, holding on to the door, but it was an old house. Old wood, old mud, all pitted with holes as long and thick as pencils, and plaster began to fall from around the door. The wall would give way in just a minute. And Lillian put her hand over Sophie's mouth, and Sophie's eyes opened wide in the dark, and Lillian felt Sophie pressing her lips against her damp palm, making little kisses in the dark. And Lillian whispered into Sophie's ear, "Not a sound, Ketzela." And in the outer room, a man none of the Labes had ever seen drove an axe blade into her father's neck, and Lillian held Sophie tighter. And Osip stood up in the dark room, and the moon edged out briefly, and Lillian's last glimpse of her husband was of a tall, thin knight in an ivory nightshirt, fumbling for his glasses. A man whose father's cattle grazed not far from the Labes' barley stabbed Osip as he entered the outer room, and his body fell in front of the privacy curtain. Lillian wrapped her blue wool scarf around Sophie's neck and shoulders, tucking the ends into her little nightgown, and Osip cried out, and Lillian slid the small window open and lifted Sophie up, and she kissed her on the forehead. "Run to the chicken coop," Lillian said. "Hide behind the chickens. Quiet. Quick. I love you." She pushed Sophie up and out, holding her into the last possible second so the drop would not be too hard. She may have said, "I love you," too softly. She wonders about that all the time, but she couldn't say it again. She couldn't call out across the yard. And she heard the thud of Sophie's solid little body. She did hear her say, "Oh, oh," very bravely, and she heard Sophie's footsteps, hesitant, heading for the chicken coop. Lying beside Judith in this warm, narrow bed now, her skin tightens with the shock of that cold night air when she had been sweating just seconds before. She had made her hands into claws to go for the man's blue eyes, which were bloodshot but sky blue even so, and he reached back to cut Lillian, and the constable called the men by name from the street. He raised his voice in a friendly, firm way, as if he had caught boys smashing bottles behind a barn or bothering a girl in the market. "Go on home, comrades, big night for everyone. Go on home now, enough?" And the man slashed Lillian once across the chest, from her shoulder to her hip, and then shook his head as if she had wasted his time. And the constable called again, and the men stretched their legs to walk over the bodies of Lillian's parents and her husband, and one man knocked a teacup onto the floor. It might just have been an accident, a moment's carelessness, as he wiped his knife on her mother's tablecloth, and then the three men walked out over the door and outside and were gone down the front path away from the chicken coop. As Lillian makes her way, she is advised by a friend to get a thesaurus and find her way into America and into English. She has been further advised that she might become a good friend of the matinee idol. It's possible that the matinee idol took her for a decent girl who would be shocked and heartbroken at his advances, but Lillian has done her best to let Meyer Burstein know that that isn't so, that she welcomes whatever it is he has to say. She brushes her breasts against his arm every time he moves like a gentleman to the street side as they walk. And she lets him know that she is, although not opposed to matrimony, she has no political beliefs about it at all, and she's not bothered by the idea that two people might exist very happily in an arrangement that does not include a marriage license or a big party at the Concourse Plaza Hotel with a white gown and rented carriages and a terrible 5-piece band playing If You Knew Susie, and all of it costing serious money that Lillian can imagine much better spent on things a person really needs and requires, demands, claims, and also covets, craves, and desires. Lillian's thesaurus is now her constant companion. And the bookman sold her Webster's Dictionary, which is fine and useful for what it is, and Roget's thesaurus, which has a little story for every word. This is like this, Roget tells her. This is related to this other. People on the street might say this like so. And then there is the antonym, introduced in 1867 by Mr. C.J. Smith, which is sharply, exactly, and also completely not anything like that first word. Comfort, gladden, brighten, relieve, refresh, renew, idiomatically, to give a lift to. But on the other hand, distress, perturb, bother, agitate, grieve. Her dictionary, and especially her thesaurus, and the prospect of becoming Meyer Burstein's concubine comfort her like a mother's hand. And Lillian has made all of this as clear as she possibly can to Meyer, and more than once. And he has said several times while they were walking with a little surprise, and once when they were eating hot dogs, "You're a very sensible girl." And Lillian loves hot dogs. She is a connoisseur of American hot dogs now, and she knows to point to the ones that she wants and not the ones at the back. And she would choose a Nathan's hot dog over a Shabbat brisket any time. And Lillian nods and smiles. This is exactly what she has been telling him and exactly what she has been telling herself. She is not dead. She is not what her friend Yaakov calls corpsey. She is just sensible. Meyer Burstein takes an apartment for the two of them, a love nest, as he says. He puts a key and $5 into her hand and says, "Tonight will be our night of nights. I'm back by 11. Oh, there might be romance, Lillian thinks. Sighing, eating while looking into each other's eyes. And she finds nice napkins and a pretty cloth for the table, but if they're going to be big gestures, if there's going to be chicken thrown on the floor for passion's sake, she wants to have things ready. She loves the getting ready the most. She loves the shopping. She loves the bold walk through the fresh fruit and the Italian man watching her and judging her and then smiling and then offering, snipping a sprig of grapes from the stem with a beautiful bird-shaped pair of very small scissors. And she puts the grapes in her mouth and wants nothing more than to sit on the barrel in front of the greengrocer's for the rest of her life and contemplate the sweet, glassy crunch of grapes and silver scissors just for cutting them, and her new life as a woman with $5 and a rich lover. And she sets the capon on the sideboard with little plates leading up to it in a way, Polish style, cold potatoes with dill, herring and sliced onions and cream sauce, herring salad, carrot salad, white rolls, softening butter. And she lays out in a fan shape the square American cookies with pink frosting that Meyer likes and cannot get at his mother's house. And she paces the flowered carpeting. She looks at the room. It's like a stage set for a romantic comedy. And she struggles into the peignoir set that Meyer has left draped over the bedroom door for her. And it is ridiculous. It is irritating tight lace across the breasts and filmy green chiffon foaming down to her ankles, and it's cheap stuff, Lillian can tell. She can see the dark of her nipples and between her legs in the mirror like 3 stones at the bottom of a murky ditch. And it's 10, it's 11, the show ends at 11, it's midnight. Lillian takes a chicken leg and a bottle of wine and puts her feet up on the table. He might not come after all. It's not nice to be so late, but it's not terrible that he doesn't come. It is rude, crass, inelegant, uncouth, also lacking in social refinement. And she has bought the food he likes and put on the ridiculous nightgown and spent the evening waiting for him, only flipping through her thesaurus and prepared to have sex and willing to say to anyone who might want to know that Meyer is her lover and willing to be his lover, his beloved, his flame, his inamorata, his sweetheart, if that's what he wants. And she picks up the other chicken leg. It's not so bad, the chicken and the wine, and the room is warm enough. And she never, ever minds being warm. Only the cold frightens her. And she has the dictionary and the thesaurus and the newspaper in which she has begun reading a letter in the Bintel brief section from a decent young girl. They all seem to be decent girls, Lillian thinks. You can't really fill a section in a newspaper with letters from smart girls with their legs wide open for business. And the writer of the letter is worried about her fiancé, the Talmudic scholar who has not come to Shabbat dinner with the decent girl and her expectant family for the last 2 Fridays. Someone, and Lillian can picture the someone, a nosy, hurtful bitch from the 3rd floor, herself abandoned. Someone has seen the Talmudic scholar at the dance hall bringing in Shabbat with a tango. And this is how Meyer's father finds her. Bare feet on the table, green nightgown halfway up her white thighs, laughing out loud at the suffering of a decent girl. "Oh, got to know Mr. Burstein," she says, standing up, pulling down the nightgown, looking around the room like a woman trapped in a fire. "I got a key," Reuben Burstein says. "You don't get up. Finish your chicken." "I am up. I get my robe," Lillian says, and she is blushing so hard her ears hurt from the inside. "You look fine the way you were," and his eyes are gleaming. Lillian says, to understand a little better what is happening here at midnight in Meyer's apartment, "It would be for propriety for you and me. I should get my wrapper." And Reuben Burstein shrugs. He seems to wink at her. "Oh," Lillian thinks, and she sits down again without the robe, and she sets her legs back up on the table, and they both watch the hem of the nightgown slide up and stop at her knees. He sits down across from her like she was waiting for him, like she's made him this lovely meal, and he's right on time, and he eats a grape. "If you're comfortable," he says, "I'm comfortable." And he takes off his hat and his jacket and walks past her and opens a little closet Lillian hasn't even looked into and takes out a towel. And he pushes the small decorative pillows, the ones Meyer has just bought, onto the floor and rolls his eyes at them. Lillian looks at him. "Meyer bought that bed," she says, and Reuben stops what he's doing. "Yes, and the pillows, I'm sure, and these are Meyer's sheets too," and he holds up the towel, waiting. It's a contest now. If she'd said nothing, Reuben would have taken it on himself. They would have played the gentleman and the milkmaid, Reuben Burstein and the seamstress. He moved by her innocent beauty, she awed by his imposing presence. But they can't really do that if she's going to say things like, "This is your son's bed you're planning on fucking me in." If she's going to make Reuben out to be, not that they don't both know, but why would the girl make a point of it, the kind of man who fucks his son's mistress while she's wearing a special nightgown his son had picked out for what was obviously a special evening. Reuben waves the towel. A towel you throw in the wash. You've had your bath, a few baths, you need a clean towel. Towels are no trouble. And Reuben smooths out the towel in the middle of the bed, and when he comes, although they've been all over the mattress meanwhile, he will have managed to position them both to have them back on the towel when they need to be. And Meyer is walking. Not so slowly you would remark on it, not so fast you couldn't get a good look at his green suit, his dark brown suede shoes. He couldn't really bring himself to wear a red necktie across town, not even with a black suit. He is astonished at the nerve of men who wear their red neckties around the city on Saturday nights, men who don't seem to mind the Dago brats and even his own people, their boys sticking their fingers in their mouths, sucking hard and yelling, "Hey, mister, hey, Ethel," at the red neckties. And it is a long quarter-mile from the southeast edge of the park to the mall, Vaseline Alley, Bitches Walk. It couldn't be Via Della this or Rude to Something Nice. It's just filthy words, and he can hear them in his father's big rolling voice, his "I am Reuben Burstein, and let me introduce my humble assistant God" voice. Lillian says that Meyer has the modern voice, the voice that goes with movie star looks. Your father is old world, she says. If Lillian were here, well, Lillian wouldn't be here, but if this were another place, he could put his arm through hers and be at ease. They could walk through the park for nothing, for a Sunday afternoon, and he would show her places and they would have an ice cream. The first thing he did was buy her ice cream. There is something about ice cream every greenie loves. She had coconut and her eyes flew open with surprise. She had pineapple and laughed. And when he put a spoonful of double chocolate on her tongue, she closed her eyes and moaned. And Meyer thought that it might be possible for him to be aroused by Lillian in bed if it involved ice cream. With Lillian, he would be Meyer Burstein, the matinee idol of 2nd Avenue, hilarious comedy one night and heartbreaking tragedy the next, women with flowers and not just flowers at the door after every single show, and he would not be this. Meyer is almost through the park. The man on the end of the bench at the corner, sitting next to the tough in tight pants, black curls and a sailor's peacoat, who is next to an old queen, batting violet eyelids and playing with the fringed ends of a white silk muffler, exactly like Reuben Burstein's, a thought Meyer hopes will pass quickly. That man on the end of the bench looks up. He could be any man in a gray suit, any Gentile businessman, blonde as a hussar, of course, so Meyer's shame can be complete, and the man lifts his brilliantined head like a snake and watches Meyer walk. Meyer has a good walk. He has been crossing the stage since he was 2. He can stroll, he can swagger, he can muse, lost in tragic thought. He can stumble like blind Oedipus. He can skip like Heidi of Switzerland if he has to. And Meyer allows himself to look backward toward the man without seeming to and to slow down half a beat. And he breathes in as if a baby pink spotlight is on him. And he breathes deeply into his diaphragm and lowers his shoulders so they look even broader, squared under his jacket. The shoulders, his father likes to say, are like breasts on a woman. They signal, they persuade. And Meyer pulls his chin in a little to stretch his spine, and he is as tall and long as nature will allow him to be. And the man stands up. They walk along side by side, and Meyer watches their feet on the gravel path. He cannot stop thinking about the incident in the park last month. A man was set upon by hoodlums. They held him down and gagged him with his own tie and tore branches off the maple trees and shoved them up the poor bastard's ass and worse. He died, Meyer heard, and the newspaper wrote in its awful, leering way that the fruited plain had been blighted. The rain's finally stopped, the man says. It has, Meyer says. I like your suit, the man says. Oh, Macy's, Meyer says. I have one just like it, the man says. Oh, yes, Meyer says. There are huge shrubs as tall as a 2-story building, some of them, a few bent by years of wind to make green brambled canopies. These are very popular. Meyer and the blonde man look around for police, for thieves, for harassers, for other couples. This is what it is like to be this way. Desire rises in you like a fountain of champagne. Your blood is bubbling, and you're trying to smooth a place on the dirt so that gravel will not tear the knees of your green suit. And you're pushing the spiky black branches of the bush away from the back of your neck, and instead of perfume and the faint trail of musk or vanilla or cinnamon, you get off a woman. It's the scent of his new leather belt and his cotton drawers and the smell of him, and there you have it. It is the thing that ruins Meyer's life. It is like a lion stalking his mother's house, that smell. Warm skin and grass and that close, thick scent, onion, salt, animal. The air shimmers a little as the man pulls out his cock, and Meyer would like to just breathe for a moment, but you don't kneel and breathe like a boy in a bakery when you're on your knees in front of a stranger. And Meyer closes his eyes and opens his mouth and thinks this. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me plunge straight into the story and put the obvious question. The main character is Lillian, who's traveled all the way from Russia to the United States. So I wonder, where did she come from? I mean, I know she comes from Russia, but I mean, what made you decide to write about her?
I think that writers must lie about these things all the time.
No. They don't in Amsterdam. They always tell the truth.
In almost every other country, writers lie about this all the time. I have no idea where she came from. My grandparents are all Russian Jews who made a tremendous point, as people of their generation often did, of saying absolutely nothing about the past. You know, this is not a search for any particular roots of mine. My roots are firmly located in the suburbs of New York City, and the past was very much a different country, I would say. Lillian probably came to me as much because when I was, a girl, I was a great fan of 19th century literature. And the two things that I read all the time, well, actually, there were two things that I read. One was 19th century literature, and the other one was Superman comics. And I loved the sweep and the scope of 19th century literature. And it did become clearer to me, the more I read and the older I got, that it was not only the case, as Willa Cather said, that there are only 5 human stories. What's extraordinary is how often they repeat themselves. And I can assure you that being a therapist did nothing to change my mind about that. But that in fact, there are only 2 stories. And the stories are, I go on a journey, or a stranger comes to town. And in fact, it is the same story. It just depends on whether or not you are on the back of the horse or standing in the town square. It did seem to me, as I was beginning to think about Lillian, that there was really no shortage of journeys in Western literature in which it was a guy on the back of the horse. So I began to think about an Odyssey with Lillian at the center.
Okay, but can I play the therapist, which I'm not, and suggest that writing about Lillian was a way of filling in the gap? Because you say your grandparents never talked about their Russian histories, their Russian past. So, I mean, obviously you had to do quite a bit of research for the book.
Well, I didn't have to do actually a lot of research about the pogroms because in America, I mean, the truth is, there is not a shortage of genocides to pick from in this world. And they are all not so different from one another, whether they are taking place now or 100 years ago. It is always the case that what is interesting to me is what people don't say, and what is revealed rather than told, and the gap between what people do say and how they behave. Those are the things that are always most interesting to me. I suspect that they are not interesting to me because I was a therapist. I think I became a therapist because those are the things that had been interesting to me since I was 3 years old.
And where did that interest come from? I mean, because 3 years old is very, very young.
Most little kids are interested in what people do and how they do it because it's how you learn to manage the world. If you don't pay attention to what people do and how they do it, you miss out on some very important information. And most kids actually are fairly good observers. So I was not only a fairly good observer, I was a child who spent a lot of time in the library, which is both sort of, it seems to me, for a kid like me, sort of like being in cafe society. You get to see everybody go past you, and you get to find out a great deal. But, possibly because I'm also the daughter of journalists, what people do and say and the story backstage is always the thing that interests me in any world.
And is it a logical career move, being first a therapist and then a writer? It seems to me to work.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say so. I wouldn't say so. I think that, it's not a bad career move going from being a therapist to being a writer. Of course, I was a bartender for a long time and nobody ever asked me about that.
Well, it's not on the internet. You'd have to put it on the internet.
I think that the useful training for me in becoming a therapist was learning how to listen to people and not finish their sentences for them and pay attention to what they are doing as well as what they are saying. So that's all very helpful as a writer. The fact is that writing is something you do because you wish or need to write. It is not actually in the service of any other person. And therapy is primarily an activity, narratives or not, that is in the service of somebody else.
And has there ever been the temptation to use the stories that were told to you, which I guess must have been often very interesting, to use them for your fiction then?
Well, happily, I have family and friends whose stories I can make off with, and they're prepared for that. And so there really didn't ever seem to me to be a need to take the stories from my patients. And the fact is, the only thing that makes those stories distinctive are the details. And since it is the details that you can't use, you have to leave the people in peace.
Mm-hmm. About Lillian, what seems to me very striking is, there's quite some horrible things happening to her. There's quite a bit of abuse happening to her. And she remains quite, I wouldn't say cheerful, but almost cheerful. That's where I had this idea about forgiveness. I find she's a very forgiving person. Okay, I got this wrong, I can tell you. I got it wrong. Okay.
I don't know if being powerless is the same thing as being forgiven.
No, she didn't seem to express any anger. She seemed to accept what was happening as one of those things that happened to you.
I guess I would probably say that it is not clear to me that resignation is the same as forgiveness. I think that one of the things I would say about Lillian, as I think about most people who have experienced terrible grief, is that there is often a certain kind of numbness that sets in, and it takes a long time, if ever, to recover that. One of the things that I have always been interested in is people's resiliency.
Mm-hmm.
And I have friends whose 10-year-old son was killed in a car accident, and these are people who live with tremendous grief and tremendous rage, and still get up in the morning and make breakfast for their other children and go to the movies and make love and have dinner parties. And that capacity to stay in the world and live with the anger and the grief is one of the things that is interesting to me. I think for me, I see these kinds of things as things which people live with simultaneously, not that they necessarily give up or let go of. I think that Lillian probably feels more as she goes through the course of her journey. She actually becomes less armored. She feels more.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways that makes things better, and in some ways that makes things harder.
Yeah. But she more or less seems to take it for granted that certain horrible things will happen to her.
I suspect that, like most people who have seen their families destroyed, the fact that there are people who will do bad and unfair things to you after that does not come as a surprise.
And how did you go about imagining her? Because that seems to me not easy to, you mean you live in United States in the 21st century, and you have to imagine what it's like to suffer a pogrom in Russia in the 19th century. So do you rely on the imagination, or do you rely on witness accounts, or?
Well, there are no shortage of witness accounts. That's certainly the case. That is one thing that is remarkably true of the last 100 years. There is no shortage of terrible stories that people can tell about their own lives and the lives of their families. But I think, as a writer, you don't have to have been everything you write about. You only have had to, if you're writing about somebody who embezzles $1 million from their company, you don't have to have been someone who embezzled $1 million from your company. You only have to have been 8 years old stealing the cookie out of the cookie jar. That's all that is required. And if you can remember that sense of anxiety and the thrill and the nervousness and the sweating and the guilt and the shame and the relief or the horror and humiliation, you know everything you need to know about embezzling $1 million from a company. And I feel that it is very much the same way with most of the other things. One pain is not the same as the other, one loss is not the same as the other, but if you can remember and are willing to experience it again, I think you can create a feeling of truthfulness on the page, which is, not so much about reporting a fact as making it seem true.
And so you actually have to experience it again while you're writing it.
I think so.
So it's a bit like method acting?
But by seeing the world through their eyes, so that you can see it as they see it. I mean, the thing that is interesting is not what the tree looks like, well, not to me anyhow, not what the tree looks like. The thing that is interesting is who sees the tree, and what does it mean to them, and what kind of language do they use to describe it, and that's how you find out who it is who's seeing it. And it seems to me that the first job is to enter the character.
And which do you find the most helpful? I mean, I take it you've been an actress, right? Was that a bit true?
I was a very poor actress.
Okay, but you've had the experience of being an actress, right? So which has been the most helpful, the acting or the therapy?
I think they've both been useful, but I think that fundamental impulse, that sort of inclination to enter into people who are standing someplace other than where I stand, is probably actually part of my nature. I think it is the thing that led me to these other things. There aren't any characters I create who are not parts of me. That was true, in the book that you referred to, "And Love Invents Us." I feel as close to, the high school teacher who falls in love with the 14-year-old girl as I do to the 14-year-old girl.
So there has to be a connection.
Yeah, I think no matter who you write, you have to see them as expressing some part of yourself. It doesn't have to be the obvious part. But if you can't, I think you're always going to make a mistake. It's always going to be some huge slip in their perspective or their voice that you make because you haven't really experienced them.
So it has to be plausible. It has to be credible.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. In the novel, Lillian goes in search of her daughter, Sophie, and then doesn't find her. Was it hard for you to decide not to have this sort of happy reunion at the end?
Well, I don't think I'm much given to the big, shiny, happy ending so far in my work. So that was not a difficult choice. I thought I was sort of going way out on a limb in terms of sentimentality by not killing off Lillian herself.
Were you tempted to do it?
Frequently. And the closer I got to the end of the book, the more strongly I was tempted. I actually used to wake up, and the only way I could cheer myself up was to imagine a sort of an 18-wheeler truck coming rapidly across the Alaskan tundra and her failing to look to the left. But I think, I did think about actually several different endings for a long time, and I took a long break before I went back to the ending, just so I could feel that I was approaching it fresh, with no pressure, just with a sense of where I thought the story would go. And I think it is partially for me that although her search for her daughter is very important, the journey is as much about her becoming an American and coming back to life as well, becoming a human being, as anything else. And I think the other thing that was always interesting to me is the struggle. If your child is taken in by another family, on one hand, one wishes very much that they should miss you as you miss them. On the other hand, you want them to be happy, and that would suggest that perhaps they don't miss you as you miss them. And so that struggle for Lillian in terms of her wishes and her desires for her child were also on my mind.
And how hard would it have been in those days for her to cross the strait into Siberia?
Well, it also seemed quite unlikely that in that leaving one very large country to go to another very large country, they would be coming across, each other at the grocery store. And so I felt that what seemed more possible to me was the life I imagined for Sophie and the life I imagined for Lillian, again, in part because I am interested in the way people go on even with their scars.
And do you think it's possible for a mother to go on after she's lost a daughter without actually having lost her, because Sophie's still alive?
People do all the time. And it is not easy, and they are, to me, sort of great silent heroes, but mothers and fathers who survive the loss of a child. I mean, it may be that it is not a loss in the sense of, we know that Sophie is alive, but of course Lillian doesn't. And so the fact is that people survive extraordinary losses. And what is amazing to me always is those people, not everybody, but those people who have the capacity to love somebody else, to live their life, to give something to the world.
That seems to me a very American message, that you have to move on.
No, it's not that you have to move on, it's that both things take place simultaneously. I mean, you could not move on, in which case the simplest and most direct solution would be to kill yourself. But if you're going to take up space in the world, it might be possible to do that in the face of terrible grief and loss that you never forget. And also be engaged in some pieces of the world in a way that give you some happiness and perhaps give some to somebody else.
Yes, but this seems, from my European perspective, that seems to be very much the essence of what America is about. It's a country of hope. It's the country of the future. It's not being stuck in the past. Okay, you've got your scars, but you start anew.
Well, that certainly is one of the things that America offers, is the starting anew. And I think perhaps one of the things that was most interesting to me is that because it's a country in which people often start anew, by the time you meet them, you have no idea who they were.
You mean by the time you meet an American?
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. By the time you meet a middle-aged American, you often have no idea who they were 30 years ago. And that's one of the things that's very interesting to me. By the time you meet somebody who came to America 30 years ago, and you meet them 30, you don't know who they were.
And people don't tell. It's not like, I'm from such and such.
People may tell you where they're from, but that doesn't tell you much. And so all those stories are interesting to me. It is, as you say, the positive side is the hope and the reinvention and the possibility, and the other side is that which people cannot share or tell. I will also say that
So you think underlying all of it there is a trauma, not being able to share and tell it?
yeah, I don't know that not being able to share and tell it contributes to the trauma. It probably does for some people, and for other people it is actually less painful. You know, to try to tell people who do not share your experience what a terrible experience was like can be a tremendous exercise in frustration and disappointment. And so for some people it's easier not to say. My grandmother, her English was not very good, and she had, I would say, probably about like an 800-word vocabulary in English. And she divided the world into nice and not so nice. And everything after 1915, nice. Everything before 1915, not so nice. And that was all she said. I think that this is a woman who was born into a family of 8 children and arrived in this country with 4 siblings. They never talked about what happened to anybody else. So I think, you know, her feeling was that it was a kindness not to share those stories with people who couldn't understand them. I also would say that, you know, even in the literature that following the Holocaust, one of the things that one discovers in people's accounts is that there are people who are able to go on and make lives that have some happiness in them, and people who cannot. And that distinction does not seem to me to have that much to do with one's nationality.
And would you say times have changed? Let's say that you have refugees coming into the United States from the Sudan. Mm-hmm. Would you say they still have the same sense that they can't talk about what happened?
For many people, I
it
think
might
that
be
is
better.
So. It's very difficult to come someplace and say to people, let me tell you something that will make you feel terrible. You know, most people, even in America, home of the afternoon talk show, don't actually want to spend a lot of time listening to something that is truly painful. And so people often do not tell. Some people do, and for some people, the bearing witness and the testifying and the articulating is enormously helpful and positive, and other people feel that the less said about it, the better.
And do you feel there is a duty for fiction there, or for literature, that literature should bring the untold stories?
No. I think for me, the duty of the writer is to write the best book they know how. And if it tells an untold story that's worth telling, that's great. If it tells a story that you've heard 100 times, but in a way that is new and fresh and moving, that's terrific. When there is something, for me, in which there is a message I wish to put out in the writing, or something that speaks to an obligation or a duty that I feel that I have as a writer, I tend to do that in essay form rather than in fiction. It just suits me better.
Mm-hmm. Today, is the United States still that country of opportunity, of hope, change?
Well, the primaries are interesting. I was in the Museum of the Kennedys last night in Berlin, which is
They have a museum all to their own?
Yes. I mean, it's a German museum, and I'm sure they had some funding from the
Because
Kennedys.
of the I'm a Berliner thing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
And it was, what I found myself thinking is that I would like once more in my lifetime to have the kind of president where another country might be happy to have a museum commemorating him.
Yes, okay.
I
so
think
who stands the best chance of getting that museum?
Well, I think it will depend on what happens in this country, but again, America's a big country, and so I find it very hard sometimes to talk about, you know, the American this or the American that, just because we are a country of immigrants and we're spread out over a big space. I think that there is often, you know, for the guy from Bhutan who drove my cab to the airport when I was coming, you know, who was in fact telling me his story. For him, this was a great country and a great opportunity. I do think that still happens. I think that there is a possibility that America can recover, you know, in the next 50 years from the damage that has been done to it.
It will take 50 years.
It will absolutely take 50 years. The assault on the Constitution alone will take, I think, 2 decades for us to recover from. But
okay, just tell us, are you Obama or Hillary?
I would be delighted to vote for Clinton or Obama. Frankly, I mean, I think that the country will be better served by either one of them. I have to say, I do have a particular soft spot for Michelle Obama, who strikes me as fantastic. And I do like his spouse a little better than her spouse at this point. But that notwithstanding, I think that the country actually is facing a wonderful opportunity. And I will say that the engagement at home of people in the election process is a gratifying thing to see, and to listen to people talk about it, and to see all these college kids turning out. It makes you think that it might not be entirely in the romantic past, you know, that America was a country that took democracy seriously.
Talking about immigration, the one thing you always hear about the United States versus Europe is that somehow they say, I don't know whether this is true, and as you said, the United States is a very big place, but they say that somehow when you arrive in the United States, wherever you arrive, after a couple of months, you turn into an American, okay? You become an American citizen in the first place. A bit like you said, you don't sort of talk about your roots. Whereas apparently in this country, in this part of the world, I should say, somehow people remain who they were upon arrival, okay? They will remain Italians, Moroccans, Belgians, whatever. And this sort of whole notion of the big melting pot where somehow in the United States, when you arrive there, something happens to you and you are turned into an American. That magic formula we don't somehow know in Europe. And there are some politicians who would like to get hold of that formula. How can you turn all these people into Dutch people, or Belgian people, or Italian people, or whatever, or Europeans for that matter? Is this sort of fantasy that we have about the United States?
Well, it's a big country, and there are a lot of different kinds of people. Yes, people do take on certain kinds of things, but it is also true that, of course, people hold on to different aspects of their identities in lots of different ways. And some of them are positive and some of them are less positive. And it is also true that when people are often no longer immigrants but are in the first and then the second generation in America, you see a bit of a return to the attachment of whatever their original country was, you know. You know, there is, for example, I mean, you know, there's a whole corrupted Italian that sort of second and third generation Italian Americans tend to use. I mean, much in the ways that Jews in America use Yiddish. You know, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Most of which, certainly the Italian, would be completely incomprehensible to anybody who actually spoke Italian. But it makes everybody who's Italian American feel better. And I'm not going to say this as being married to an Italian American. And they and there is that attachment, which I can assure you, when my husband's father arrived in this country,
being in the United States.
In the United States, sorry, not in this country, in my country, in the United States, speaking no English when he started kindergarten. He gave all of his children, when he became an adult, instead of, what I think was all those beautiful Italian names like Alan, Brian, Paul, I was just like, oh my goodness, it was American with a vengeance.
Like Amy.
Yes, well, my parents, like Amy, I suppose, although Amy seems to me to be a name that sort of came and went. And of course, since all my grandparents only referred to me as Amala, I didn't actually know that my name was Amy until I started public school. So I think that people have different kinds of roots that they stay attached to for all sorts of different reasons, but it is true that, at some point or another, most people who have arrived in the United States will eat at McDonald's. They will send their children to public school, and then you will begin the big struggle in the life of the family between how far is too far, how far into the American world do you want to let your children go, and that you don't get to pick and choose. I mean, one of the things that we certainly learned in America is once the ghetto wall is down, there is no putting it back up again. When people intermarry and they mix with people whom they would not have even spoken to a generation before, the world begins to change.
But is it an issue in families?
It's always an issue in families. If you have a family that arrives in a country and the parents don't speak the language of the country that they arrive in, and the children are the translators and the interpreters, there's a shift in power in the family, always. And, I think that, you want your children to adjust, you want them to make their way in the world, you want them to be successful in the world that you have brought them into, but you also see them growing smaller on their horizon, and that's true for all parents with their children, but perhaps particularly so with immigrants.
Talking about children, Virginia Woolf famously said that when and if you want to be a writer as a woman, you have to kill the angel in the house, by which she meant you have to sort of stop being a mother and a wife and just be a writer sort of thing. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, I certainly think I would not have wanted Virginia Woolf for a mother. There's no doubt about that in my mind.
She had good looks and a good brain.
Absolutely. Yeah, possibly not the best recommendation for a great mother. Good looks and a nice way with a sentence. I do have a real passion for her work as a reader. Of course it's true. I used to sit on panels, and there'd be some very, very good guy writer to my left who would be explaining how, at some point in the middle of his career, he had 5 unpublished novels in his desk, and his wife, bless her heart, was working 3 shifts a day as a waitress, and with their 4 kids, and leaving him tuna fish sandwiches on the landing. And I would just be sitting there thinking, I can't believe she didn't stab you in your sleep, But it all worked out for the best. Well, actually, in this particular case, I was thinking about it all worked out for the best, and then he left her for a grad student. But that's the way it goes. Or I'd be sitting next to a woman writer for whom I had tremendous respect, a wonderful writer, who said basically, of course I don't have any children, and the fact is that writing is more important than life itself. And I thought, why am I on this panel? Because it was a stage in my life where when my kids came to, they didn't have to really come to a door, when they came to the kitchen table, they would say, I need new sneakers for tomorrow, or I need a vest for tomorrow. I'm in band. Don't you remember? They sent home a notice. I'm in band. This is America. I'm in band, and I need like a vest that matches my pants tomorrow. And I would say, just give me a second. And what I actually got very good at was keeping a tremendous, I don't really recommend this, but it worked for me, a tremendous number of candies in my drawer. And I would just throw them at the kids so I could just finish the sentence. I'd say, I'll just hang on. And so then I would just pelt them.
Like you would do with a dog, actually.
It's not for me to say, of course. So I would just pelt them until I could finish the sentence. Okay. And then we would go get the sneakers or get the vest, and I usually wrote late at night. You do have to kill the angel in the house in the sense that there are only so many things in life that you can care passionately about. And this is not to say that writing is better than children. It's not for me. I have 3. I love them. I wouldn't trade them for anything. And if I had to stop writing tomorrow for some terrible reason for my children, I would stop writing tomorrow. I wouldn't be very happy about it. But you can't, there are really only so many things you can care deeply about.
And has it been helpful? Being a mother, has it been helpful? Like, might give some ideas, inspiration, themes, topics, stories.
I think I write about families all the time. I think I write about parents and children all the time. I've also been a mother since I was 21, so it has profoundly shaped my adult life. I remember once, during a period of my life when I was single, which probably also speaks to the angel in the house problem, when I was single, and somebody had told me that they had somebody in mind, and thought I'd really enjoy dating him, and he was like 15 years younger than me. I said, you know what, I'll probably start cutting his meat for him. I think that I was very used to being a mother. I also feel very lucky about it. I feel that, to have sort of been formed in some ways as an adult where empathy is required, and seeing the world through the eyes of several other human beings all the time has probably been useful. And it's also, as one of my children said, oh, Mommy, you always write about the same thing. Love, sex, death, and family. And I said, well, you're probably right.
Okay, well, I suddenly realized that you can ask questions as well. According to
have known that already.
According to our schedule, we should have stopped at 9:10.
Well, speak fast, folks.
Okay. Anyway, maybe some lights. Any questions?
Well, we can sort of see. Oh, look.
Well, she's very good at listening to stories. Yes. No, that was the mic. Yes, I think, no? Nobody has a burning question about the elections? Okay, no, but I have a few more, but one of them was like, so you plunged into the 19th century, and like you said, well, there's no shortage of genocides. Would you consider writing about contemporary issues, and if so, which ones?
Well, most of my writing until this was about, was sort of set in the modern world. But if you mean sort of
a big, like a genocide or 9/11 or,
I think I would consider writing about anything that both moved me deeply and I thought I could tell a good story about. I mean, those are really my standards. It's not enough for it to be one. If it is only one, then I might write an essay about it. If it is just something that is deeply interesting or moving to me. And but if it engaged me and moved me, and I felt that I could create three-dimensional characters who could move through that world in a way that would make it possible for me both to tell a story and illuminate the characters, then absolutely. I'm sort of always looking around. I'm not, having very much enjoyed doing the research for this book set in the 1920s, I'm not particularly wed to the past any more than I am to the present.
Mm-hmm. And has there been pressure on writers in the States to write about 9/11? This seems to be the big thing.
I don't think that there's some, I think that some writers, feel some urgency about that, of course. And I think, again, it depends on your nature as a writer. Whether it is something you feel that you have taken in and now have something to say about it or need to say something about it. The events in the world keep changing the world. And I think for most writers, for better or worse, we tend to have only one subject, really. And then you keep finding all the variations and all the changes on it. I think, 9/11 was a huge event, obviously, in history. As we both know, there is no shortage of huge events. Some of them better publicized than others.
Mm-hmm. One final question, and there's one from the floor. As your children say, love is one of your central themes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so here it comes. How would you define love?
Well, this is one of those moments where inside myself I find myself struggling between my wish to be cooperative and my basic difficult nature. I think, I think it's, I think Augustine says, love is that for no particular reason I wish for you to be. So I'll go with Augustine on that. Augustine for $500. But
that's a nice one.
It is nice and handy for conversations like
this. And surprisingly coming from him.
I had to look. And for me, I think I'm more like the Supreme Court Justice on pornography who says, I know it when I see it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you, Christine, for providing all the questions. Thanks also to Felix Meritus and to New Amsterdam Publishers for bringing Amy all this way. And thanks all of you. Good night.